I decided to redo my original Synthetic Dawn review because I felt that the latest patch really changed a lot of the problems that I had with it and actually made it a much better and more enjoyable experience. Synthetic Dawn is Stellaris' second story pack DLC, this time focused around breathing new life into Stellaris with machine empires. But does it do that successfully or not? Machine empires play and feel a lot like hive minds. You cannot build a republic, a democracy, or any kind of inclusive government with machines. Much like hive minds, non-mechanical life forms cannot exist in machine empires, aside from the rogue servitors, which we'll get to in a bit. Machines also do not eat food, but instead consume large amounts of power and also cost about 100 minerals per to build, much like robots, requiring you to rethink how you build your planets and play the game. They also do not naturally grow at all. And this adds a really interesting dynamic, as you must balance growth with expansion. Expanding too fast can make you weak and ripe for conquest, while expanding too much in a military can slow your expansion. Getting into early wars can be insanely costly, as you spend all those minerals trying to build ships that don't go into building pops, because you do not naturally grow at all. This is a playstyle that definitely requires a lot of attention and control. It's definitely meant for more micro-intensive and advanced players. One of the really interesting changes with Synthetic Dawn is the tradition swapping system. Basically, playing as different government types will swap out different tradition trees for others. So if you're playing as Machine Empire, for example, you get more machine-based ones that benefit robot building speed, robot building cost, and so forth. It's a really great system. They've also added a new Ascension perk for Machine Empires that allows you to terraform planets into machine worlds. Basically, it changes it graphically into a Coruscant type look. There's lights all over, it looks like a massive factory in a sense. It also even changes the tile look when you're building buildings on the planet, which looks really neat. You get a pretty decent buff towards any kind of production on that planet, so it's pretty worthwhile in the later stages of the game when you just don't have anything else to throw your energy at. It does cost about 10,000 energy, so you're definitely not going to be doing this into the early mid stage of the game. Moving on to civics, the new Machine Empires lean heavily on specific civics similar to Devouring Swarm and Fanatical Purifier from Utopia. You have the Determined Exterminator, which is a lot like a Fanatical Purifier. Exterminators cannot engage in diplomacy with organics and must purge them through either outright killing them or using them as batteries matrix style, which is pretty cool. Exterminators gain bonuses towards things like weapon damage and ship cost and stuff like that. They're pretty fun. They're kind of a different flavor to a Fanatical Purifier in a way because you can use organics as batteries in a sense, but they do very much play in a very similar role and fashion. The biggest difference is really that you can build pops rather than grow them organically like a Fanatical Purifier, so you can expand really quickly if you need to. Next up, you've got the Driven Assimilators, which I was insanely disappointed by when the game first came out, but they have since buffed them to be a lot more exciting and a lot more engaging. Basically, Driven Assimilators play a lot like a Borg. Your goal is to assimilate other species into your collective. You start with around 4 of your pops as cyborgs, and you can choose to allow them to grow naturally, and they don't require food since you're a cyborg. So it's kind of an interesting take on how you play. And you can also then assimilate, as I mentioned earlier, different species that you conquer. Kind of like the Borg, so you can assimilate other species into your collective, and they've since buffed them quite a bit to be a lot faster and a lot more engaging in the assimilation process. So it's actually a lot more fun to play. The biggest penalty is that, much like a Fanatical Purifier and a Devouring Swarm, you're disliked by a lot of the galaxy for being a driven assimilator. So you're going to have to deal with a lot of war and constant fighting. But if you can really get to the point where you're constantly assimilating people, it's pretty powerful since you don't have to deal with things like factions and stuff like that. Now finally, you've got the Rogue Servitors. Now Rogue Servitors are robots created by their creator species to automate their everyday life. They have since taken over the Empire and consider organics as biotrophies. Quite literally, if you go into the set rights, you can see that's what it's considered as. Now biotrophies are unlike other pops in that they don't work, they don't research, and they consume a lot of resources while they're in those pleasure domes. So you have to kind of think how you're going to plan your empire. Now you do get a bonus for having biotrophies. For every 10% of your population, you get influence and resource bonuses, so it is worthwhile. And so it's kind of an interesting playstyle where you have to balance how do you manage these biotrophies with how do you manage the empire still at the same time. You can also decide to just create your own machine empire rather than one of these 3 preset ones. It's kind of like creating a hive mind without a devouring swarm. You just got a couple different traits you can pick from. However, they're not particularly amazing or interesting in any way, shape, or form, and as a result, it feels like a very small, limited form of a machine empire. One of the more interesting changes that I was absolutely blown away by was the advisor voices that come with Synthetic Dawn. You can choose between 11 new advisor voices rather than having the preset default Veer. And there are all sorts of really interesting ones, like the Hive Mind, where you can hear the many different voices, the Machine, that sounds like a machine, the Xenophobe, it's very aggressive, you got the Egalitarian, that sounds like he's talking almost over like a loudspeaker or something like that. It's just really interesting. It adds a lot of depth to the game and personality to each individual playthrough. There's also an entirely new crisis called the Contingency, and while I don't want to get into too much detail to spoil it, I will say that I found it much more challenging in many ways than the Breathoran or the Unbitten. It's got a very interesting story chain behind it as well, and it has very interesting special interactions with machine-based empires. Overall, it was pretty well done for the most part, and it created some very interesting scenarios. There's also 2 new music tracks, one of which has been playing in the background to give you a feel for it. They have kind of a machine spin to them compared to the original game, but they fit in very well with an interesting synth style, much like the original game. At the end of the day, it all comes down to the million-dollar question. Is Synthetic Dawn fun to play? Yes. Is it worth your money? Yes. At $10, you get an insane amount of value here, with 3 completely different, diverse ways to play, and a 4th if you want to create your own machine empire. You don't get as much flair with it. You get a new contingency crisis, you get advisor voices that add a lot of flair to existing playthroughs, and you also get 2 new interesting music tracks to spice up old playthroughs and give you kind of a metallic, mechanical feel to it. It's really a great expansion for $9. You get a lot of value here, and there's not a whole lot to complain about when it comes down to it. So, Synthetic Dawn gets a 9 out of 10. It's a fun expansion, and I would highly recommend it to anyone who's looking for more of a side grade option to Stellaris, where you're just looking for a little bit more content, a little bit more replayability.